Hi, Tod Bolsinger, here to talk about surviving the sabotage. Sabotage is a normal part of leadership and leading change because it comes out of the very process of leading change. Perhaps this is the best way to think about it. Change comes through conflict, and conflict is about managing heat. So if you're trying to lead change in your organization, think about creating an environment that's like a crock pot, a slow cooker. If you put in some meat and some raw vegetables and a bottle of wine and some spices and you put it at the right heat at the right amount of time, then after a while you're going to get a wonderful, lovely meal. If you turn it up if you keep it too cool, nothing's going to cook. No transformation happens. Come back some hours later and what do you have? Spoiled meat, still hard vegetables, a wasted bottle of wine. If you put it up too hot, trying to make up for it, well then you can scorch it. And if you scorch it and it burns, then everything is ruined and you throw it out. In neither place does anybody get any kind of meal. But if you keep it at the right amount of heat, at the right amount of time, well then what happens is everyone gets fed. The change process is like that. And leading change is about managing heat. And your responsibility as a leader is to create a holding environment where that change can happen. The right amount of heat at the right amount of time that will eventually lead to the right amount of transformation. So hear it again. It's the right amount of heat at the right amount of time. Now, what happens when other people can't handle the heat? Ed Friedman puts it this way. He believes that because of what happens to human beings, there will be sabotage. And as a fact, what Ed Friedman says is, if you are a leader, you should expect sabotage. Notice this. It's an expectation of leadership. It's normal. It's natural. It's what happens. Here's what Friedman has to say. Let me read you this longer quote. The important thing to remember about the phenomenon of sabotage is it a systemic part of leadership. It's part and parcel of the leadership process. Another way of putting this is that a leader can never assume success because he or she has brought about a change. It's only after having first brought about a change and then subsequently endured the resultant sabotage that the leader can feel truly successful. Did you see that? It's only after having first brought about a change. You've got to get everybody to agree to the mission statement. You've got to get people to decide that it's a good thing. You've got to get people to vote that they want to bring the change. You've got to get people to start implementing the change. And then after you've brought the change, then there will be sabotage. And it's only after you first brought the change and then subsequently endured the resultant sabotage that the leader can feel truly successful. What do we learn about this? Sabotage is normal. It's natural. It's to be expected. It's what a system naturally does to protect itself. Let me put it even more bluntly. Sabotage is not the bad things that evil people do. Sabotage is the human things that anxious people do. Sabotage is not the series of bad things that evil people do. It's the very human things that really anxious people do. When people are anxious, they sabotage. Again, it's natural, it's normal, it's to be expected. And it's not until after you have first made the change and then survived the sabotage that you know that you can be that you've been successful as a leader. Let me ask you to think about this. When have you ever experienced sabotage in your leadership? Where did it come from? What did it look like? Did you recognize it as sabotage at the time, or only now looking back on it? In 2001, our congregation at San Clemente Presbyterian went through a huge congregational meeting. It was a big vote. We planned for it for months. We were coming together to decide whether we were going to start a huge capital campaign because we were committing to tear down our buildings and rebuild our entire campus and rebuild it from the ground up. So here's the setting. A group of mostly older people who had 20 years earlier built a brand new sanctuary. many of them had lived in this congregation and in this campus for years, were basically having to being asked, are you willing to tear down all your buildings except your sanctuary and rebuild them all and pay for it? Let me make it even worse. This was 2 weeks after 9/11. If you were at all remember 9/11, you know the stock market crashed and people were anxious. And as a church, we were situated 2 miles from the Camp Pendleton Marine Base and 2 miles from the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station. We were actually warned on 9/11 that the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station could be one of the next potential targets. The anxiety was really, really high. But for the better part of the previous 2 years, we've been working on this giant master plan. You see, we had a big problem as a congregation. We wanted to be a multi-generational church. We were committed to trying to be a 3-generation church, a church where parents and children could worship with grandparents, and a place that would look different than so many of the other congregations that were popping up at the turn of the century, that were getting kind of separated by generations, older people in one, younger people in another, young families in one place, retirees in another. We saw this as an opportunity for us to have a really unique witness in our community and to bring people together across the generations. The only problem is that our campus was not made for that. Right after we opened our sanctuary doors and people came out of worship, the older people would go out onto the patio. We're a beach town and with a beautiful ocean view. And the older folks in the church who didn't have kids would be able to sit out on the patio, talk with their friends, enjoy a cup of coffee, and give praise to God for living in such a beautiful place. But if you had young kids, well, then what you needed to do is go pick them up from the preschool or for the Sunday school. And usually what would happen is you'd have to walk through the parking lot to get to the children's area. You'd pick up your kids in the play area, and then if you wanted to go back and fellowship and spend time with other people and enjoy a cup of coffee, you'd have to walk your kids back through the parking lot. How many young parents do you know are willing to take their kids by the hands and walk them through a parking lot just so they can have a cup of coffee and make a new friend? Not very many. But 2 weeks after 9/11, we decided that we needed to do a master plan. We were committed to being a church that was together. The only problem is that what separated the patio from the play area was the church's original sanctuary. It was now our chapel. It was probably the most beloved place on campus. It's the place where most of our older people had been married. A number of those folks had worshiped there years before we built the new sanctuary. Some of them had buried their loved ones and celebrated them in memorial services there. And a lot of people in our congregation had been baptized in that place. It was really holy ground. But 2 weeks after 9/11, we brought a whole group of people together, and we asked them if they were willing to vote to tear down that chapel, and indeed tear down all the other buildings except the sanctuary, and rebuild the entire campus and pay for it. Because we believe that there was a whole new generation of people who are going to be moving into town. There was a building boom going on, and young families would be coming. And we believe that God wanted to serve those young families by giving them a congregation that would be a community, a multi-generational community that would help them raise their children and know the love of Christ. And 2 weeks after 9/11, the congregation voted to tear down their buildings and pay to rebuild the campus. It was an incredible moment. I was thrilled as the pastor. 2 weeks after 9/11, incredible act of faith. Shortly after that celebration, we started plans. We began a capital campaign. We needed to raise a lot of money, and we needed to raise it from the people in the room. And I felt confident because, well, people had raised their hands and voted for it. We'd gotten it passed. But then all of a sudden, my business administrator came to me and said to me, "Todd, what's your plan B? What if we don't raise the money? What if people don't commit to this?" I looked at him and said, "What do you mean? What if people don't commit to it? They voted for it. We told them. We laid out all the facts. And it was 2 weeks after 9/11. They couldn't have been more anxious. It's now months later. We're doing much better. I don't see what's the problem." He goes, I think you might have a problem." Finally, after a little while, I was able to coax it out of it. You see, at the congregational meeting, one of the men who raised his hands was a guy named Rick. Rick was one of the wealthiest men in our town, and everybody knew it. Rick was one of the charter members of our church, and everybody knew how important he was. Rick was a guy who could write a check easily for half of the money we needed to raise. Rick could write checks in the millions of dollars. And what I didn't realize at the time was that during the congregational meeting, when everybody was sitting there preparing to vote on whether we would tear down all the buildings and pay to rebuild it, a whole bunch of folks held their hand down until they saw Rick raise his. When Rick raised his, well, then a whole bunch of folks jumped on board, because what they were thinking was, if he's willing to write a check for this, we're going to get this thing done. What I found out from my business administrator is that Rick and a bunch of his friends had all decided that they weren't crazy about this plan. They just didn't want anybody to know about it. They didn't want anybody to know that they weren't crazy. And so they hatched a plan, they said, chuckling while they were playing cards one night. They would all write checks for $1,000. $1,000. Not $1 million. And one of them said, well, watch that boy from LA fall on his butt. I was stunned. He hadn't voted against it. He'd never said a word. I couldn't understand what his problem was. And then someone explained to me, do you realize the buildings that you're about to tear down are the ones that Rick helped build 30 years ago? The fellowship hall that you said is now out of code, he built it. The very buildings that he gave himself to at another time of his life are the ones that you're saying we've got to tear down because they're not of any use. Nobody had told me. I didn't know. And he was silently seething. So the man who probably could have written a check in the millions was going to write a check for $1,000. It's sabotage. It's normal. It's natural. It's not the bad things that evil people do. It's the human things that anxious people do. Sabotage also shows up when the going gets tough and other people, like your business administrator or your staff or others, run out of courage and begin to waver. What's your plan B? What's your fallback position? What are you going to do? Ed Friedman puts it this way: a major difficulty in sustaining one's mission is that others who start out with the same enthusiasm will come to lose their nerve. Mutiny and sabotage come not from enemies who oppose the initial idea, but rather from colleagues whose will was sapped by unexpected hardships along the way. Have you ever had any colleagues, like my business administrator, or like other staff members, who now want to, instead of moving forward with the plan that you're so convinced that God wants you to do, now start to get anxious and worried? And pretty soon, their lack of enthusiasm becomes contagious. If you have a moment, maybe today, maybe now, or maybe another time, you might want to actually have a conversation about sabotage. I found this material works much better if you're in a place where you can actually think about a particular experience, kind of like I did with Rick. Think about one time that you experienced sabotage. What happened? How does thinking about it as a normal response of a system to change help you understand it? And in hindsight, how would you respond differently than today? If you have that in your mind, then you ask yourself, what do we do with sabotage? How do we survive and how do we live? If you can't believe you're successful in leading change until after you've made the change and survived the sabotage, well, what do? Let me give you the little mantra that I learned from some folks at the Lombard Peace Institute who talked a lot about the way in which you survive in the midst of highly anxious systems. First of all, you got to start with conviction. You got to have a clear sense that this is what you're supposed to do and what God wants you to do. You've got to have done a lot of discernment and be in a place where you're ready to give yourself completely to the task. And if you do, if you start with conviction, well then, stay calm, stay connected, and stay the course. Stay calm, stay connected, and stay the course. What's helpful to think about at this moment is that the most important person in the system is often not the person who is the actual authorized leader. The leader in a system is a person who's able to stay in the middle of the chaos and anxiety and pain and stay focused on the mission. This is our conviction. This is what God wants us to do. This is the thing that we must be ready to do. And then from that place, stay calm, stay connected, stay the course. Let me talk about staying calm. The best thing you can do to be calm in the midst of sabotage is to be a trustworthy person, to focus on being steady and trustworthy, to focus on your competence, do your job, keep caring for people, and be congruent. Don't change your convictions or change your approach just because people are getting anxious. One of the most important things that I had to decide about Rick is that I'm still his pastor. That doesn't matter whether he supported it or not, doesn't matter whether he was passive aggressive or not, it doesn't matter whether he had a lot of money or not. What mattered is I'm his pastor and he's part of the church. And whether he's going to be participating in this or not, God knows. And so if he raised his hand and committed to give $1,000 when he could give $1 million, and if a whole bunch of other people committed because they thought he was going to be paying the bill, well, that doesn't change God's knowledge of the situation. So the best thing I could do is to continue to be focused on being a trustworthy pastor, of making sure that in every way that Rick needed and others needed, that I wouldn't waver. And that part of the way of doing that is by continuing to do my job and continuing to show up and be the same congruent person that I was trying to be before I knew someone was sabotaging me. So be trustworthy. Second, work on maintaining your self-awareness and manage your own reactivity. If other people are getting so anxious that they're beginning to sabotage you, it's the moment where you've got to calm yourself down. You've got to be aware of your own reactivity. You've got to be careful about not making it worse by lashing out, even if you have a right to, even if you think that you deserve, even if you'd like to call them on the carpet or call them out. You're going to do much better if you can maintain your own self-awareness and manage your own reactivity. One of the keys to this that has been really important to me is to distinguish between self and role. Self and role. Remember this, you're not your role. You must bring yourself to your role. You must be as committed to being as authentic a leader as you possibly can, as congruent a leader as you possibly can. You must bring your true self to your role, but you're not your role. At San Clemente Presbyterian Church, when we finally did raise the money, and we were able to, even with Rick writing a check for $1,000, praise be to God. When we finally did the building project, we finally got it finished. We finally moved into the new building, and I remember when they came to me and said, we've rekeyed the entire place. We've got brand new lock system and a brand new key system, and we're giving you a one key. A key that'll open every door in the church because you're the pastor and you get a one key. What I realized was I had this key that nobody else had. I had this access to every door, to every room, to every place that I needed to be. It was a one key. But what I also realized is that I had more than a physical one key. I had an emotional and spiritual one key. I could walk into any room in the church in any meeting, and no matter what the agenda was, I could sit down and join the conversation. Pastor, we're so glad you're here. Help us with this. I could walk into any Sunday school class in the middle of any lesson, and they would stop. Oh my gosh, Pastor, so glad to have you here. We're in the middle of a conversation about Jesus and the woman at the well. Would you like to give us insights that you know about this? I found that I could walk up to groups of people talking together on the patio, and they would immediately stop what they're doing and welcome me into the conversation. I can remember a family that was in the middle of kind of a heated conversation. Then I stumbled into the middle and tried to back away, and they immediately looked at me and said, oh no, Pastor, we're so glad you're here. What do you think is an appropriate curfew for a 13-year-old? I can remember people praying in a circle, experiencing my presence, just walking up beside them and breaking open their hands and grabbing on mine and having me join and nudging me to close us in prayer. I had access into every holy moment in that church. I had access into every place in that church. I had access into every room. But if I went home and walked into my teenage daughter's bedroom, she would look at me and say, Daddy, you're interrupting, just the way I taught her. In our family, you don't walk into a room without knocking, and you don't break into a conversation without saying, excuse me. And it doesn't matter who's in the middle of something. Nobody's so important that they can just interrupt in any way they want. Not even Tod. You see, Tod doesn't have a one key. The pastor has a one key. And on July 30th, 2014, when I left my congregation, I had to give up my one key. Today, I don't have it. And indeed, as part of our tradition, I'm not even welcomed back onto the campus until the new pastor settles in, feels comfortable in their role, and then invites me formally back. So even though I can see on social media all kinds of people whom I love celebrating great events at the church, I'm not welcome. And even though I see other people who at times might want to bring me into church decisions, I'm not allowed to. And even though I might have a few opinions upon the direction they might be going in my absence, that's none of my business. Again, these people aren't trying to hold me out because they resent me. It's because I was their pastor. You see, they love Tod, and they treat me greatly. And I get beautiful Facebook messages for my birthday, and when people come through town, they want to see me, and I get hugs and appreciation and love. They love Tod, but I was their pastor, and so I'm not allowed to be in their life as a pastor. It's the difference between myself and my role. And what I found is by keeping a clear distinction between myself and my role, to bring myself to my role, be as authentic as I possibly can, but not be my role, well then because you're able to distinguish between yourself and your role, well then you're able to better handle the sabotage. When the sabotage comes, remember, they're not sabotaging Tod. They're sabotaging the pastor. Because God has called the pastor to lead them and to lead them into change. Stay calm. Also, stay connected. You stay connected by giving the work back to the people, Ronald Heifetz says, by staying connected to the people who are most anxious, by giving your presence to them and reminding them of why you're there. You stay connected to your supervisor if you're a person who works under someone else, because you want to be really careful to help them see you as a person who is close to them. It's hard to sabotage someone who has a deep relationship with you. You stay connected even to your opponents. As it says in The Godfather, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. What this reminds us of is our tendency to want to flee from people right when they start to sabotage actually has to be resisted. We need to move toward the saboteurs and work to stay closely connected to them. Stay calm, stay connected, and stay the course. You must have persistence in the face of resistance. What Ed Friedman says is this, that if you start with convictions and you calmly stay with them, especially in the midst of resistance and sabotage, well, pretty soon the system will begin to take courage from you and will begin to adapt to you. If you have a clear conviction to bring change, well then bring the change. Work with your leaders, gather and build consensus, come to a decision, and then know there's going to be sabotage. Strengthen the people around you to know it's coming also, and try as a group to keep your conviction and stay calm, stay connected, stay the course. And mostly be reminded that part of the great good work of the gospel is that even those who might sabotage the work of God, which is what we humbly hope our work is, can often be brought back along into the fold. When Rick died, he asked me to do his memorial service. Over the years, our relationship grew much closer. I think he knew that I understood that he was against our building project. And over the years, I began to be a bit more sensitive to the fact that that building project had really been hard on him personally. I think he took it personal that we had torn down the buildings he'd once given his resources and his time and expertise to in order to serve his church. And because I think I cared for him and stayed with him and stayed connected to him, he was able to come along and become a supporter in the mission of the church. What do you do with saboteurs? Start with conviction. Stay calm, stay connected, and stay the course. Thanks very much.